Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 10th of February. In today's video, we're focusing on two parts of the front line. We're going to start off by looking at Russia's recent advances over the past 2 days in northern Avdiivka and how that affects Ukraine's logistical situation. Then we're going to look at Russia's renewal of offensive activities east of Chasiv Yar. So let's begin by looking at Avdiivka, and just as a reminder, due to the Russian penetration really taking a lot of people by surprise and due to the pace of the Russian advances really increasing in relative terms, there is a lot of ambiguity about the specific streets, the specific blocks that are under Russian control. So I have expanded the gray zone, and I'm going to be trying to report as conservatively as possible with the advances because there is still a lot of contradicting information coming from the Ukrainian side, the Russian side, and then again, a lot of these areas could still be considered a gray zone as there's still not full Russian solidification of these new residential blocks that are taking control of in northern Avdiivka. Now, with all that being said, it is true that over the past 2 days, the Russian forces have started strengthening their positions in these northern residential sections of Avdiivka that are mainly comprised of private residential buildings, not really apartment buildings. So I'm talking about this area in this rectangle, this red rectangle. And from there, they've been using that as their base from which troops are coming in. So you have a lot of Russian troops coming in from the north from these dachas. You have a lot of troops coming from the east along roads that start off in Kamyanka further eastwards. And then they connect in this specific point. And then from there, those infantry squads get dispersed to other parts of the line of contact to continue the Russian offensive. And so one area where this is being done at the moment is along Donetska and Chistyakova streets. So these two streets over here, these streets are extremely important, and we're going to explain why in detail later on. But just for the moment, you should know that the Russian forces have taken over a large portion of these two streets, and by virtue of doing so, they have gotten control over certain portions of the rail line, including the rail bridge. And so there is significant Russian pressure in this direction. And in addition to the Russian pressure occurring further westwards, they're using their positions on these streets to attack southwards along two specific roads where there are currently clashes going on between the Ukrainian defenders. And in terms of the units that the Ukrainians are using, it's mainly the 110th Mechanized Brigade, and then you also have several smaller formations such as border guard detachments, police forces. There's also some special forces operating in the area. Separate rifle battalions are also engaging. So they're the ones that are defending the Russian advances that are now occurring along Sapronova Street, so this one over here, and along Lesia Ukrainka Street over here. And the Russian vector of attack in this region is extremely important because it is a means by which the Russian forces are approaching an area of Avdiivka that is very critical. It's an area that consists of more high-rise apartment buildings, not the high-rise apartment buildings that we're used to from Gvartal district, the southernmost district of Avdiivka, but they are still apartment buildings, 2, 3, 4 stories high. And so there is a utilization that the Ukrainians have. It does go to their benefit to have those firing points. They also have the hospital in that area. They have the train station and several other large structures, including industrial facilities. And so by virtue of the Russians attacking to the northeast, they are approaching those areas and beginning to fire upon them. At the same time, there are a lot of maximalist claims being made by Russian sources that came out today specifically, and so there's not geolocation to confirm this. There isn't even a deep state update as of February 10th when I'm recording to corroborate this either. And so I'm not going to say it as a fact, but I do want people to know about it, just to get an idea of where the Russian information space is at the moment. And so they're claiming that the Russian forces were able to advance along Stepova streets, and this road running along the coast, as you can refer to it, and eventually actually getting control over the Donetsk beach is as it is referred to by the locals, that is adjacent to the quarry over here. And so the claim being made is that the Russian forces were able to take over that beach, and the line of contact looked something like this, with the Russian forces advancing along several roads, taking over additional private houses and the gardens and the fortifications that come along with that, and by virtue of doing so, approaching the Ukrainian positions located in the quartz facility over here and the electrical substation to the south. And I'm not gonna argue about the veracity of that, but Certainly, the Russian forces already do have a salient in this region, and if the reports coming out from the Russian side are true and they have further expanded the salient that is adjacent to the Avdiivka quarry, and this is a danger that I haven't seen discussed that much, as a lot of the focus is going to the Russian advances that are occurring a bit to the west along the rail line, which of course we'll talk about. But this section of the front line is also important, and the reason is the Ukrainians do still have a lot of resources that are being held up in dachas, in trenches, in tree lines, in fields that are located east of Avdiivka. And the reason why the Ukrainians are holding that is in order to prevent the Russians from attacking head on into the eastern section of Avdiivka. So you do have a lot of Ukrainian resources that are being put into this region. And as you can see, the Russian salient is occurring behind those Ukrainian positions. It's a flanking maneuver that allows the Russians to totally bypass the Ukrainian positions that are being built on the front line that have been sent to that region that is pretty far away from the main Ukrainian garrison in central Avdiivka. And so that also puts central Avdiivka in risk, the Russian arrow in red that I've marked, but it also puts the flank, the western flank of those Ukrainian positions that are currently in this area that is less dense, that is less connected by roads to the main arteries of Avdiivka. It puts them in danger of being cut off. It puts them in danger of being attacked from an area that they have not prepared to defend yet. Now let's once again look at the most widely discussed and most important part of the battlefield, and for really good reason, and that is the area around the rail line. So we know this to be the confirmed line of contact, but today, according to some smaller Russian Telegram sources, and I've also seen this discussed not by official Ukrainian sources, but some pro-Ukrainian affiliated accounts, regarding a potential Russian advance that occurred further westwards from this position over here, which would include the Russian forces getting control over the dachas and the gardens over here, and getting a foothold within the automobile facility and the post office located, let's measure this, located just 200, 300 meters away from the current line of contact. And when you measure it out from the industrial avenue, it is only about 400 meters away from that road. And we're going to talk a lot about Industrial Avenue, but if you zoom out, it's marked in yellow over here. Industrial Avenue, you can see how it enters Avdiivka from the village of Orlivka. So it starts in Orlivka, goes westwards or eastwards through the coke plant, then goes south, and from there the road just makes its way throughout the entirety of Avdiivka. It goes into the central part of the city, it goes into the Kvartal district, and then from there, of course, it branches out into the rest of the city. And so now the reports that are coming out, the most recent ones that I can confirm the veracity of, they're saying that the Russians are only 400 meters away from that specific road at that point. Now, what we do know for sure is based on geolocated footage, and so we do have a geolocated video from the 9th of February, which shows the 110th Mechanized Brigade, once again confirming they still have elements in northern Avdiivka, which is a big issue because they also have to deal with southern Avdiivka, so their forces are split between different parts of the battlefield. But in any case, in this video, they have their drones dropping grenades onto the Russian squads as their infantry continue advancing. And so in this video, you can see how the Russian squads, they start off in the forest, they use the foliage as concealment, and from there they're able to advance closer and closer to the line of contact, and eventually they make it along the northernmost houses in the urban parts of Avdiivka, in those residential houses, and they make it all the way to this geolocated marker, which is very, very close to the rail line. So at least we know that the Russians are at this position, although some of them were killed or injured by those drone strikes or those grenade drops. It is still confirmation of the Russian forces being able to move along this predetermined route. It also means that the Russian forces are now very close to the Ukrainian positions located in the dachas just to the east of the coke plants that are still probably under Ukrainian control. But as time goes on, more and more of it becomes a gray zone and an area that the Russian forces are beginning to probe in the southern regions around here. Now the Ukrainians are doing their best to protect the narrow strip of land in between Industrial Avenue, as it's called, marked in blue, and the line of contact. As you can see, it's an extremely narrow strip of land. We could argue about whether it's 400 meters or 600 meters, but either way, it is very close to the range of a lot of Russian weapon systems. Of course, long-range ones are still going to make it no matter what. So you have, of course, the Russian Air Force, MLRS systems, artillery fire, targeting all these areas. But now, due to the Russian forces just being so close within this residential section, you have small arms fire, you have ATGM fire, longer range RPGs, snipers, all targeting the Ukrainian positions in this narrow strip of land. But nonetheless, they are defending. They are now actively moving reinforcements to this narrow strip of land because the Ukrainians do have some reserves that are stationed in the rear around Orlivka, Severne, Berdichi, Semenivka. You can't really call them reserves. They're reinforcements that are going to be moved in that were stationed on the rear. Some of them may have been fighting on the flanks of Avdiivka and are now being diverted to fighting within the city itself, as it's a more critical part of the front line. But either way, the Ukrainians are making the decision to send in additional men. You could say right now it's in the hundreds, and they're beginning to dig in, fortify certain buildings, industrial facilities, digging new trenches in this region. And so a lot of that fortification building is also going on further south along the Avdiivka rail station, because that area is also a pretty narrow strip of land and the Russian forces are threatening. And so you have a lot of Ukrainian buildup going on in these nearby industrial facilities. But the Russians are taking advantage of Ukraine's predicament because they are concentrating a large amount of forces in such a narrow, very small area, very small surface area. And that means that they're able to effectively use their Fab 500s, Fab 1500s on this area, on a lot of the structures, on a lot of the troop personnel that are stationed there. And of course, you have very regular artillery shelling of this section of the front line. The Russian advances in northern Avdiivka, and additionally the pace at which they were conducted, does put into peril the entirety of the Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka. We're going to start off by looking specifically at each region and how they're being affected, starting off with coke plants. Due to these recent Russian advances, we know this to be the more conservative front line, but even if this is true, then the Russian forces do have positions that are extremely close to the coke plants. You could say, if you take out a measuring stick, about 400, 500 meters. So of course it is within the range of fire for the Russian forces, with really most of the weapon systems that they have at their disposal. But that's not even the main point. The main point is now the Russian forces do have the capability to accurately target the entrance and exit points for the Ukrainian facilities, for the Ukrainian forces that are being moved into this region, or that could potentially be moved out depending on what the Ukrainians decide. So if you look at the map over here, in green I have the secondary supply roads that go into Avdiivka. So that includes dirt roads, tracks, things of that sort. In yellow you have paved roads, and as you can see, there aren't any that enter directly into Avdiivka, or I mean into the coke plant, besides the one in yellow over here that sort of leads further south into the city of Avdiivka itself, as we talked about. But if you look further north, there are these two paths that lead into the western section of the coke plant. And so those are now very close to the Russian line of sight, the Russian line of fire. And so any sort of reinforcements being moved in, any sort of potential resupply efforts or potential efforts at withdrawing forces will be much more difficult. Of course, it is still possible. It's possible through open fields, but it just means that doing so becomes more dangerous and increases attrition rates. The Russian forces were also able to create a wedge in between the two different sections of Avdiivka. As you can see, they created this salient, and it means that Avdiivka is no longer working as a single cohesive body. You have two different sections. The coke plant is now acting on its own and can be used as a base to attack the Russian side as they're on the defensive, and can be used as a means by which to help defend the southern areas of Avdiivka, the center of the city, all of that. And so now there is a lack of communication. They're more isolated, and so now the Russian forces have divided it up and can begin clearing it out individually, which is something that makes it much easier to clear out these areas as they can't act as a single cohesive force. So as we said, the Russian advances have put the industrial avenue into very great danger, as the Russian forces are very close to it, and even if they don't take it physically, they are still firing upon it. So any sort of effort that is being made by the Ukrainians to reinforce or resupply the positions over here is going to be targeted very heavily by the Russian forces. Any sort of reserves or any sort of reinforcement that's moved into this narrow strip of land, as they make it in, and once they make it in, they're being targeted heavily by a plethora of different means by which the Russians have firepower, and that again increases attrition rates. So besides this specific choke point being marked in blue, what else do the Ukrainians have to supply the city? Well, if you look, there is a path that branches out from Avdiivka. You can't see it on the map, but Avdiivka is over here. It goes to Lastochkinia over here, this village. And then from there, it's this dirt road that goes all the way into Industrial Avenue. But even this is very close to the current front line if you take a measuring stick. And it really is a matter of 500, 600 meters before reaching the Russian line of contact. So it's not much different in that regard. Then if we look further south, there is this branching out that occurs, and then the dirt road reaches into the Kvartal district. But then again, the way in the area in which it branches out is still very, very close to the line of contact. It is a bit farther away, but nonetheless, it is about 1.2 kilometers away. So the Ukrainians have now shifted a lot of their efforts towards moving resources through the southernmost path that they have at their disposal, and that is the path running along here. It's a path that goes from Severne all the way into the Kvartal district, the district that we've talked about as being Ukraine's southwestern stronghold, has a lot of the high-rise apartment buildings, and so now that dirt road is one of the main ones that the Ukrainians have to rely on. And think about that, en masse, moving in a lot of equipment. If the Ukrainians want to move in a lot of reinforcements, it has to be through that, or it has to be through open fields. So no paved roads. That's extremely unreliable, and it's in an area that's very narrow. If you look at the difference between the gray zone in the south and the Russian line of contact in the north, it's only about a 4.5 kilometer wide area that the Ukrainians have to go through to actually enter Avdiivka. And if we're being realistic, the Ukrainians really only have about 2 or 3 kilometers of this region that they can pass through in order to actually reach Avdiivka. And so there are massive safety concerns about that. There's concerns about how to properly organize a withdrawal from the region, how to organize sufficient amount of aid to be sent in to the forces that are still holding the line. And all that's being caused because of the initial problem with the Russian forces even having a presence that's right next to these key choke points. So just as a final note, if we look at the troop compositions, and I talked about this in my last video, which I recommend watching, but you do have about 1,000 Ukrainian troops in the coke plant area. Then you have probably 5,000 to 6,000 within the Avdiivka city. And then when you look at the wider sector, which includes the flanks, you do have another 15,000 plus the rear. That's around 15,000 troops. And so a lot of those troops are now being moved into the front line. A lot of those troops, though, they either were engaged in fighting on the flanks of Avdiivka, and so you need to have some sort of force to fill the vacuum over there, or they were retreated from the actual battle in Avdiivka and had to be withdrawn to the rear. And so there really is a question about whether the Ukrainians will continue to move brigades that are stationed on other parts of the front line and divert them to fighting in Avdiivka, as they've done very recently by moving in 2 recent brigades that were fighting in southern Ukraine, the 23rd Mechanized Brigade and the 71st Jaeger Brigade. Those ones were recently moved in. And again, if the Ukrainians really do want to conduct localized counterattacks, I'm not saying they will, but it is something that may have to happen in order to maintain the territorial integrity of the choke points, at the very least to hold on and defend what they currently have. Either way, that will lead to very high attrition rates. Localized counterattacks, those could cause massive ratios of Ukrainian deaths in comparison to the Russian deaths, just because the Ukrainians would be on the offense, and by virtue of that, they would be having a higher likelihood of being caught in Russian fire, not to mention the fact that just by doing the numbers, the Russian forces do have much significant advantage in terms of firepower in this region, regardless of whether they're on the offense or the defense. So either way, there does have to be a conversation had about the types of units that are being moved in to reinforce this direction. Now let's look at the Chasiv Yar front, which over the past month has been relatively quiet as the Russian forces have focused a lot of their attention at penetrating Avdiivka, taking advantage of that to further advance. And so now we're seeing the resumption of the Russian defensive activities following a troop rotation. You're now seeing the Russian forces increase artillery strikes, and that's being used as cover for the Russian advances. So on the 5th of February, we received a new video from the 217th Airborne Regiment, which is part of the 98th VDV Division operating in the northern Bakhmut area, which shows their FPVs hitting the Ukrainian known positions within dugouts and within the trenches that are near the line of contact. If you remember, I talked about this in some older videos, the Ukrainian forces took advantage of the Russian lull in attacks in this region to gradually regain positions in Bodanivka. They also regained some positions in the areas to the south of it, including open fields and roads, and they were also able to reestablish control of dugouts in and around the cemetery, the Popivske cemetery as it is referred to. So the previous front line looks something like this, with the Ukrainians being stationed over here. But around the 9th of February, there was footage released which shows the 217th Airborne Regiment, this unit I have marked on the map over here. They launched an attack with the cover of BMP fire, so the BMPs led the way, firing onto the Ukrainian positions in trenches and dugouts, especially along the cemetery area where you do have fortified Ukrainian positions that were overrun. And those areas were overrun by the Russian infantry platoons that were involved in the fighting. So the Russian course of their offensive looks something like this, advancing along the 0506 road, taking over the cemetery area, and then advancing further south and clearing out this tree line over here, and clearing out this forested region over here. And now the Ukrainians have been forced to withdraw further south and further westwards. You do have the Ukrainians still in control of tree line south of Avdiivka, and generally the heights in the fields to the east of the Kalina suburb of Chasiv Yar over here, which is the major stronghold that the Ukrainians have to the east of the Donbass Canal. And the other stronghold they have under their control is Ivaniivske, and by virtue of the Russians advancing, they now have positions on heights that are overlooking Ivaniivske. They've gotten control of additional heights, as the area marked in red over here is generally on a high ground. And so now the Russian forces do have positions to the north of Ivaniivske, taking advantage of those flanking operations. But the Ukrainians do still have a line of defense in the fields and ravines that are located to the north of that village. And at the same time, the Russian forces are able to use those heights to overlook the valley on which Avdiivka is located. But as I said, the Ukrainians do still have the height advantage in terms of controlling heights north of Avdiivka and some of the areas to the south of it. Now, a big issue for the Ukrainian defenders in the sector, especially around Ivaniivske, as reported by Deep State, is that there are issues with the construction and engineering of new trenches and fortification systems for the garrisons in these ravines. They're not conducive for building new positions, especially while they're at the line of contact, especially during the winter season. And so that is one of the issues with why the Ukrainians have not been able to fortify this area as well as they would have liked. And so now, with the Russian forces resuming their offensive activity over here, it does seem like they're going to be on a sustained period of attack. So we're going to have to wait and see where they actually conduct those new assaults. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.